So thank you for the generous introduction. I thank the chairman of the Board of Trustees as well as the president of the ICG. And I would, in a way, given a short introduction to the topic was already given. And as far as I could, tell, it summed up reasonably some of the pros and cons of some of the debates. I cannot assure you that I will persuade you on all the grounds. But let me start off by saying just maybe that will be a dominating sort of theme in how I fundamentally look at it. Do we know if we really take this whole metaphor of putting band-aid to the problem of poverty that was mentioned, and I think that's a reasonable one, I've heard it from other sources too. I really want to ask the honest question that which one of us would go through life without needing band-aids or bandages? That's a serious question, right? So I think that if we compare the problem of poverty and the problem of economic development as of a whole range of what can you say, ailments or illnesses that prevent people from fulfilling their full productive as well as social and human potential. I really conceptually think of poverty as something that in a way leads to stunting of potential. Okay, so that's a reasonably broad definition. I would say clearly, as much as for health problems, having only band-aids or first aid box at your home is not going to be a substitute for having hospitals or specialized surgeries and a whole range of modern medical technology, as well as long-term good nutrition and well-balanced diet. So we all would need all of that for our health, right? So similarly, I don't think any serious advocate of UBI, and there are various varieties of it, even though it's a sort of a term that used around quite loosely. For example, I will come to this. Right now, what we have been discussing in the public domain, given the elections and everything about the minimum income guarantee, that very precisely is not UBI. It has some connections, so it is a variant of various things that are being talked about. And the reason it's not UBI is that it's targeted to the poor. So any program that is specifically targeted to the poor, by definition, is not UBI. Okay? But I want to come back to this general point that I really think that the problem of poverty has many dimensions. As much as for human health, you need a whole range of things for us to lead a full and healthy life. For poverty alleviation too, any one magic bullet is problematic. So therefore, anybody who's overselling UBI as saying, look, this is going to substitute health, education, job growth, economic development, clearly that is kind of saying that, look, here's a first aid box and that's your entire kind of medical or health sector expenditure. That would be misguided. Okay, so I'm leaving that before I kind of properly start with my talk. I want to leave that make that very clear, because otherwise it would almost be a debate that I would be very happy for the first person to go on the other side and say, are you crazy that you're going to say you're going to replace everything with a flat payment and be done with it? Okay, so it has to be viewed as one component of several instruments, many such instruments of development. And even there, it's not completely unambiguous that we should have it. There are issues of feasibility and desirability. And therefore, my point would be, and maybe this is where, as an academic, we have an inherent limitation of reflecting too much on the costs and benefits of everything, as opposed to being able to bang the table with confidence, which, for example, is the job of policymakers as well as politicians, to say that this is the magic bullet and this will work. Okay, so with that sort of preliminary thing moved out of the way, I am going to make a very sort of limited case for the UBI. And even there are costs and benefits, and it's not clearly, after the entire discussion, what I hope to have is having for all of us a slightly more nuanced understanding of some of the costs and benefits of these alternative policies, as opposed to wholesale conversion of all of you into the cause of UBI. I hope a bit of that happens too, but I'm just setting expectations here by saying I'm not going to do a kind of rah UBI kind of speech here. Okay, so let me now, because especially the introduction was very detailed and informative, that's why I wanted to, in some ways, with that hanging in the air, I needed to clear that in terms of setting what I'm really trying to do. But now let me get on with the, how I had proposed to discuss today's topic. So let's first define this animal. What is it? And there's a lot of confusion about it, and that's exactly why I said that the current thing that is being debated in the media because of the, the announcement by the Indian National Congress of the minimum income guarantee, and I will come to that because it's very relevant and it's connected. So the first thing is it's a cash transfer. Okay, so that immediately rules it. That immediately separates it out from transfers that are in kind, such as food that's available on ration shops, food and fuel, and similarly any form of coupons or vouchers or subsidized product that immediately separates it out. It's literally money that you're going to get. Number two, it is unconditional, which means you don't have to do or be anything to qualify for it, other than presumably being an adult who is a legal resident or citizen of the country. Other than that, for example, and what it immediately separates it out from, it separates it out from, is the mic, can I be heard at the back? Hello? Yeah, okay. So it immediately separates it out from anything such as programs that have been running quite successfully in countries like Mexico and Brazil, where the government does give out cash transfers, and these are substantial amounts, but they are contingent on children of those families having certain health and educational statuses which are regularly monitored, and it's almost like conditional on compliant behavior in these dimensions. People then get a certain cash transfer, right? So it is so therefore it immediately separates it out from these conditional forms. Third, it's universal, and this, believe me, is where most of the fight is. I mean, on all the other elements, there would be disagreements, and there is scope for having different discussions, but it's the universal element that, in a way, is the most controversial one, and rightly so. And that's the one I'm just pointing out at where the big argument or where the most of the discussion is around. It basically is for everybody. It doesn't matter. Okay, so what is it ruling out? Any targeted program, most targeted, when you say anti-poverty program, it's typically targeted to the poor, yeah? Whereas the universal basic income, as well as the roads we have, yeah, they are universal basic roads. I mean, of course, that's my lukewarm attempt at humor here. I hope I improve in the course of the evening. But the point is, as much as certain public goods and infrastructure, they're universal and, of course, accessible to everybody. Of course, depending on the vehicle and your otherwise, your resource position, you may have better use of roads than others. But fundamentally, though, you don't have to be anything or do anything to be able to use them. So universal is not targeted. Okay, so that immediately separates it out from targeted programs, of which Arvind Subramaniam, one of the really wonderful jobs he has done as chief economic advisor is to produce a couple of really high quality economic survey reports. So whether one agrees with the policies or the discussions, they were actually quite informative and in some ways reflective of the current debates. Yeah. So as Arvind Subramaniam, in his discussion of this 2016 chapter on universal basic income, he says there are literally thousands of programs. If you really list together all the central and all the state programs of various yojanas, from housing to nutrition to everything, there are literally thousands of it. Okay, and they are typically targeted to the poor, and in particular, they would be contingent on people having something that is called the below poverty line card, BPL card, etc. So by being universal, it means it is not really needed. So long as you can prove yourself, a citizen or a resident, you would qualify for it. Okay. And it also immediately means it is not related to age or gender. So you can think of, for example, pensions as a form of universal transfer, but it's age contingent, okay? And once again, when you talk about universal basic income, it removes any socio-economic or demographic kind of contingency as to who you should be to qualify, okay? And finally, and this may be not so controversial or not also that much remarked upon, it is given to individuals as opposed to families, okay? Now, it might sound innocuous enough, but some of the advocates of UBI have pointed out that given the gender power asymmetries within households, this itself could have a potential that as opposed to, say, everybody or a family-specific transfer, this actually treats every individual as a citizen, and you qualify for it once you reach a certain age. Okay, so that's really defining what the thing is. So if you look at the debates, and some of this were already foreshadowed in the really pithy and informative introduction. So if you can sum up these as to why cash, right? We can well argue that why not a number of other things. And why lump sum? Why give everybody a lump sum amount? Why not make it, say, proportional to income? Why not make it sort of, if you have a threshold of income, below that you get it, otherwise you don't, etc. And why universal and not targeted, right? Now, these are, as I go through the discussion in the next 45 minutes to or so, I will come back to some of these themes. But here, let me summarize the key ideas here so that we have a roadmap as to how I approach, or how several economists, I'm not the only one who has been writing or thinking about this issue. First is, cash has the advantage of essentially giving people choices. So just think about it. I always, one of my very good friends, Ritika Khera, who works a fair bit with John Rez, they have been very tireless advocates of things such as the food rations and the public distribution system. So one of the things I always jokingly mention, that why do we expect salaries in cash? Why not have our groceries delivered to our houses from whichever organization we work from, and various kind of service coupons to be given to us? Why are we given cash at all? Okay, we immediately begin to realize that everybody would like to have at least some domain of choice where, one size doesn't fit all. And rather than trying to guess what would be most useful to you, whether it's housing benefits or school benefits for your kids or whatever that is, giving you cash would be the advantage. That doesn't rule out problems, and I will come back to some of the problems that were already mentioned in terms of, suppose you don't have the right financial infrastructure, suppose you are a homeless person, etc. So, and once again, my general approach to a lot of these problems, and this is really more a philosophical or conceptual way I approach any policy. No policy gets 100 out of 100. I cannot offer any policy on anything that would basically work in 100% of the cases. So therefore, when we are debating alternative policies, we're going to have to ask that how is that minimum income or the Prime Minister's Kisan Yojana that has been announced by the current government, how is that working out for the homeless person? How is that working out for the tribal in the forests and so on, right? So therefore, when you are going to be critical, or you're going to raise a particular criticism against a policy, in all fairness, we should apply a uniform test and run all the other policies through that. And in the end, it's a matter of relative ranking as opposed to getting 100 out of 100. Okay, so this is again just setting how I'm going to approach it. And of course, you may have your own views about which one in a given setting could work better. Okay. So that's basically the key argument as to why cash is preferred. Essentially, it gives people more choices, subject to some caveats, and assuming certain infrastructure. As I always like to, hopefully this one would be appreciated more than my first attempt. Think about giving Robinson Crusoe some cash. That will be useless. Okay, because Robinson Crusoe is shipwrecked, living in an island. There's no market, there's no trade. Money is useless. Okay, so therefore, clearly, you would need some infrastructure or some assumptions to be true for cash to be useful. The second one is why lump sum and why not some function of income? Yeah, which makes, this is a really compelling argument. And honestly, when I first heard of the policy, maybe I can't speak for everybody, but like most people, that was my thought too, that look, why give up so easily? Why not, rather than having a flat amount, why not try to make it exactly like our taxes are, or, many of our other things, that it should be some measure of income, and why lump sum? Now, there are two reasons for this. One is why presumably somebody like Milton Friedman, who's one of the, what can you say? I'm thinking of the right kind of regal metaphor of the king of free market economics, or one of the really high priests of it. The reason he advocated it is the same reason why some conservatives also advocate lump sum taxes, namely anything that is not contingent on who you are or what you do is going to affect your decisions the least. Okay, if you know that, look, everybody has to pay a certain minimum tax, okay, which again in the case of India and having such low income levels, this is a harder thing to think about, but think about a more affluent country. Whatever is the amount, okay, suppose everybody has to pay a certain minimum tax, and that's something that you should do. The good thing about that is it's simple, and it is what the reason economists like it is it's essentially it's unrelated to anything you can do or you be, and therefore it will not really affect your decisions too much, right? So that's kind of the ideal argument as to why some people like it. But I come from a gharana which is more of Joseph Stiglitz and economics of the second best, and which is really the economics of the post 80s and 90s, where you never really assume that the ideal is achievable. Because if the ideal was achievable, if the policymaker had the full information about the world, everything, then clearly some version of central planning would work. Okay, and whatever is therefore going to be the decision of that planner, it would of course depend on your particular situations. We know that doesn't work out, both conceptually for reasons of that among others Hayek and Ronald Coase pointed out, and also practically you can also see from various examples why that kind of informational demand, that any kind of policy that is too dependent on specifics is going to lead to problems. So basically the reason, the kind of non-Friedman reason why people advocate it, it's a second best way when you really cannot verify income, and the moment you try to verify income, you have the typical problems of inclusion errors and exclusion errors, and people try to game the system in various ways and so on. So therefore, in a way, it's an admission of defeat, like all second best solutions are, that yes, ideally, if I could measure income perfectly and figure out people's situations, I would try to tailor it more to the specifics of them. But look, this is going to be a hard problem to start with, just to again foreshadow some of the India-related discussion. We know that in India, about 3% people file taxes, and about 2% people actually file income taxes, personal income taxes, and about 2% people actually pay income taxes. So these figures are improving slightly, okay, but clearly we can see that therefore, because vast number of people are in the informal sector where there is no payroll or income tax filing information, income verification is always going to be a big problem. Okay, so therefore that's the reason why a lump sum amount and why not proportional income, and that also essentially segues us into the third point as to why is it universal and why not specific, because in a way it's a sub case of the previous point, that if you feel that okay, only the very poor should deserve some support, and for which the moral case was outlined, some notion of social justice and fairness, but there the problem is of course that if individual incomes cannot be measured, even if that is the general case as to why lump sums are better, in that case figuring out who's below a certain threshold income is de facto the same problem as the second case, right? That you don't need all the incomes, but even to figure out if somebody is above or below a certain threshold, that itself is going to be a problem. Okay? Now let me come to some of the putting, so this is kind of giving a little bit of a limited introductory remarks as to what is that about UBI, what are the kind of first level answers to the obvious criticism as to why is it cash, why is it a lump sum and not a proportional amount, and why is it given to everybody and not to the very poor or deserving in some other ways. Now, next comes the question of, look, something can be desirable on certain grounds, and you could again have pros and cons views of that, but let's also come to some of the practicality or the feasibility aspect of it. We may all decide that, look, everybody needs to have good health and education and etc., etc. We can have our wish list of things that could be done, but clearly there's also a budgetary realisticness as to what is possible and what is not. And therefore, one of the first things that I think a lot of the debate in the Indian context and elsewhere too, I think gets a little bit wrapped up in a somewhat, what can you say, not very relevant angle, is if you don't do anything and just add this universal basic income, that would be fiscally a very irresponsible thing to do, because clearly you need to have a funding plan for the universal basic income. So this is important, because otherwise we can wish a lot of things, but if you don't have a realistic budget plan as to whether it's going to be spending cuts or certain taxes that would have to then use to fund this, this is not a serious plan. Okay, so this is very important, because it also addresses what I said at the very beginning as to the most puzzling aspect of the universal thing. Why is it universal? Why should a poor person walk away with, whether say 1,000 rupees a month, and as well as a very rich person also qualify to have that 1,000 rupees per month? That does sort of raise questions about what's the fairness or what's the moral argument here. So this essentially is giving an answer to that question, that because it would have to be funded, if there was no such thing, you just dropped it from the skies, then there is that problem would be very much real, that why should a poor person and a rich person get it simply because you cannot locate who is who. So like in a flood relief area, you drop blankets and other reliefs from the sky, you're just literally trying to drop the money and let people pick it up, right? Clearly it has to have a tax plan or some kind of spending cut plan to fund it. And this is where the progressivity will have to be built in. And that clearly would be the logical thing here, because clearly to fund it, really the poor on balance will be net recipients of any government program, and the rich on balance would be net payees out of this. So therefore, whatever is the funding plan, that has to be explicitly mentioned, because otherwise left, if you just state it as a universal basic income, it doesn't pass the smell test as to why not, really what really qualifies the rich to have this kind of support from the state. And this point is already something that I mentioned because of the observations at the beginning. I don't think there is any serious argument, and those who do it are not really thinking through, that it's only to provide some immediate relief from extreme hunger and destitution, and it is not a poverty alleviation strategy. For that, growth and employment is, in the long run, the only way people can move out of poverty. No direct welfare can help you do that. It may, by definition, if I give people lots of money, at that moment they may technically come out of the poverty line, but that is going to be not sustainable, because if there are structural reasons or behavioral reasons that cause them to be below poverty, eventually they would fall back there, and that is the thing. Now here, what I have in mind is extreme cases of, say, malnutrition. If some of you've been following, the Indian news, there was a piece in the media that came out about a district in Jharkhand where there's a lot of sort of famine-like condition and some extreme cases of child malnutrition that was discovered. And I'm sure I saw a piece in Live Mint, and many other places covered it. So that is the kind of extreme form of hunger and destitution that it literally is going to be addressed at, to provide some security net, and it is not really a substitute for a long-term poverty alleviation strategy. For that, there is no substitute for increasing the size of the pie and creating opportunities for everybody. Now, let's review a little bit about where this has been tried out, okay? And once again, I think just let me just quickly review this. So there are forms of this that have been tried out in various countries, and as we speak, there has been some cases where Finland, because of political factors and some of the reports that said people were not looking for jobs who received it, that led to the withdrawal of it. And then there are, of course, in the Netherlands, the Canadian province of Ontario, and in Scotland, it's being discussed and so on. So, and in various developing countries too, and just to give you a sense of the past here, the proposal that Milton Friedman was working on under Richard Nixon, he was the one of the members of the Economic Council to Richard Nixon, and his program of war on poverty, which is ironic given that he was the center right or whatever, the right wing coming from the right of center of the US political spectrum, but Richard Nixon did after Johnson, who happened to be a Democrat, so on. These two presidents were involved with initiatives that happened to be quite a bit aware of the problem of poverty and trying to combat it. So Milton Friedman's negative income tax proposal, I don't want to bore the assorted audience here who with some of the economic jargon. So therefore, without getting into the details of it, Milton Friedman's concept of a negative income tax is really a combination of a basic income and a proportional tax. If you put the two together, what it makes sure is that the moment your income starts increasing, the benefit you start receiving, that starts going down. And once a threshold is crossed, you start paying into the system. So it's a classic kind of, in some ways, that's the classic minimum income guarantee if you could observe income, and not the variety that is being talked about in India right now. And I will again come to that, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that given the relevance of it. Okay. So my point is, it has been tried out in certain forms in various countries, and with a set of results that we have access to. But what got me and many other Indian economists interested in it, actually, I think is very, that's where sometimes the history of economic thought is interesting, because actually it's been around, as was rightly pointed out, for several centuries. In fact, I'm going to come to that in the next slide. But parallel to this discussion about mechanization, robotization, and the kind of looming threat of unemployment in developed countries, for the last 30 years, entire discussion of poverty alleviation through the World Bank, various multilateral aid agencies, as well as various governments that have serious anti-poverty programs, there has been an increasing focus on cash transfers. I'll just give you one example under the present government of India. So the direct benefit transfer, DBT, that has been experimentally tried in certain areas, okay, where essentially certain in-kind benefits, such as food and fuel, you could have the option of essentially that being given to you in the form of cash. That's not UBI, that's not, therefore, the only reason I mention it is an example of a cash transfer, which is considered to be less distortive for the reasons that I already mentioned. But in some developing countries, Abhijit Banerjee of MIT, who happens to be one of my advisors when I did my PhD at Harvard a long time ago. So Abhijit Banerjee has a forthcoming paper in the annual reviews of economics, and in which I also have a paper that looks at more of the theory of it, where he summarizes and surveys the evidence of actual examples of UBIs in various developing countries. Admittedly, the sample of, in the number of countries for which it has been tried out and serious evaluations are going on are relatively limited. We don't have a huge number of countries that are doing it, but is still accumulating evidence that essentially presents a broadly positive picture, but I will come to some of that a little bit, okay? And indeed, these are some of the surveys that talk about that. But before I get to that, let me just, in a way, I think it's good to think about where this idea, it sort of almost seems like maybe many ideas that they come in certain historical cycles, and then maybe for a number of reasons they go out of fashion, but then again they tend to come back after a couple of decades or whatever. So it's actually, to the best of my, when I read up the literature, Thomas More's Utopia, which is written in the 16th century, proposed the idea of guaranteed income, and then there are many other important thinkers in the West, such as Paine, as well as Fourier, John Stuart Mill, etc., who have essentially discussed varieties of it. And in more recent times, as it was pointed out, it has been received support from economists from more of the left of center, such as James Smead, James Tobin, Tony Atkinson, and on the right, Hayek and Friedman. And other than Atkinson, in which case that's a very unfortunate situation, all the others are Nobel laureates. Atkinson too should have been, in my view, but these are all very eminent economists coming both from the left of center and the right of center. And essentially where it is happening right now, in the debate in the West, where this universal basic income has really been going on, is really the presence of this looming threat of unemployment as well as globalization creating extreme job insecurity and churning, the kind of things leading to the political changes we are observing, whether it's for Brexit or the US and other places where certain what is now being called right-wing populism is on the rise. Okay, and essentially it really all across the world there's a challenge of the welfare state. If you have a certain changed economic environment, how do you go about doing the welfare state? That's where I think in the current round historical episode where we are living through, where UBI has come back into fashion, maybe again it will go into a bit of a lull and again come back. Now if I just want to let me skip some of the general discussion because I'm mindful of the time, and I also want to allow for some Q&A. So essentially, let me also, so what I was going to say is that, look, you can think of various anti-poverty programs that the poor that are given to the poor. I'm sorry. Essentially, you can think of these various policies that are addressed to the poor in three broad categories. One is essentially giving the poor greater access to markets. So you can think of any employment generation, credit programs. These are all trying to improve the poor's access to markets and thereby creating more of a self-sustaining path to which they can take advantage of market forces and climb out of poverty. Then there is this whole category of policies that have to do with public services and infrastructure, where essentially you could say health, education, and a number of other things, including security, etc., which would, of course, and the need to improve the access of the poor for that. And finally, where UBI is being debated with other proposal, it has to do with the transfers, where essentially these are explicitly redistributive in nature. So once again, it connects with the original thing that I said at the very beginning of the talk. Therefore, there's no question of any serious discussion of UBI to essentially eliminate the first two categories, or even for the third category, kind of saying this should be the only thing. In fact, maybe I was, being in Goa and feeling relaxed and happy, maybe I was over-ambitious and I was going to propose something which is a hybrid proposal, which combines UBI with something else. So depending on the time I have available, I'm going to come to that. But I want to stick to the script and walk you through the core things that I wanted to say. So here, this was meant to be a more detailed discussion of the advantages of UBI that I briefly outlined at the very first slide. So here, let me not spend too much time on this, but just this is to go back to the original point that was made, that look, UBI is like any other policy. It is going to need its own administrative and infrastructural requirements. So therefore, the argument for that has to be that it is relatively less demanding of this compared to other programs, but nobody should think that if we just start it at an absolute level, there would be no problems and we can immediately sort of, the flight will take off and cruise at a high altitude. So there will be some of these problems, okay, and you would need certain conditions. So essentially, let me now come to and take on some of the core criticisms of UBI and essentially try to address them using both theoretical as well as empirical arguments. So if I step back a bit, what I have done so far is locate the idea of UBI broadly as a welfare and development policy, gave a little bit of a kind of pluses and minuses short list of what UBI constitutes, given a bit of a relationship of UBI with other development and welfare policies, and made the case that this is not going to be a be-all policy because then some of the problems are very obvious. So now let me sort of go through this particular point about one of the things that is frequently heard. Look, it is all very good for Milton Friedman and libertarians to say that people should have choices and we shouldn't be told what we should eat, how we should spend our money, yeah? But sometimes, and especially in the modern era of economics, in the last 2 decades, one of the most rising areas or growth areas in economics has been behavioral economics and psychology, where one of the core arguments is the entire basis of the libertarian thinking, right, the conventional sort of conservative economic thinking, is individuals are best judges of what's good for them. Okay, and you only defend policies to the extent it is not interfering too much with their individuals to make their own decision. But if people have certain cognitive and behavioral biases, okay, just to we all face that. So it's not targeting any particular group who would have a monopoly of this problem. We all have problems of certain limited cognitive resources. If we have too many things to deal with, we start making mistakes, right? We often are tempted to postpone things that are not very pleasant, okay, which is also another way of kind of the same problem fundamentally, is we want to overspend money now and think we are going to make up and save later. So that is again like postponing things that are not so pleasant and try to bring forward things that we like to do. Okay, and you could argue that, look, if this argument is very relevant, then that's an argument that would be against UBI right away. Okay, why? Because you could argue that people may not be using the money in the way that in some ways prevents the kind of extreme malnutrition in that Jharkhand example I gave, and one can each pick some of the examples we can all think of from our personal experience or from our general perspective as to what is an example of destitution where somebody with a little bit of more financial resources perhaps could have prevented a serious tragedy of one kind or the other. Now, it turns out this is a debate that is hard to settle theoretically, because you could well argue that people are the best guardians of their own interests, or you could well argue that, look, there are enough evidence about people sort of the usual way people sort of refer to this is wasting it on drinks and gambling and other things which you could argue are inessential or not even particularly what economists would call merit goods, which are kind of justified for from the social point of view. So this is where one of the recent surveys that Abhijit Banerjee has done along with colleagues, and this is only the earlier paper and the more recent paper is still about to be published, essentially large randomized trials of experimental incidents of government giving out cash transfers in 7 different countries were studied. And these are really large samples because these are government programs and not a private NGO or a private organization doing a relatively small scale thing. So they involve tens and thousands of samples of individuals. Across these programs, they found no systematic evidence of the impact of the propensity to work or the overall number of hours worked for either men and women. Now, you may think that, okay, this sounds good, but wouldn't we expect if people have lots of money, what happened to that Finland case? Yeah. So why were those guys not bothering to look for jobs so much? So the answer to that puzzle would be found in the word in this sort of slide, which says essentially these are all developing countries. The evidence is largely from developing countries, and given the cost of living as well as the wages that are prevailing in these developing countries, having a small amount of cash transfer really cannot afford you to withdraw your labor supply. So clearly this argument I would not expect to happen in a relatively affluent country, or those of us who are not hopefully extremely impoverished. If we get some extra money in a steady way, some of us would possibly cut down on our work. But if you're really at the margins of subsistence, this turns out to be less of an issue. There's another study by 2 World Bank economists, Evans and Popova, who review evidence again from 19 different studies, and where basically they look at the impact of cash transfers on what you could call non-merit or inessential form of consumption, which is a polite way of what people often colloquially say that they will drink or gamble the money away. So these are the kind of things that you could argue that from the social point of view are not justified for taxpayers' money to be subsidizing sort of these kind of non-merit or inessential consumption. So the third feature, so therefore going back to one of the possible critiques that why cash and why not kind, is going to be that, look, people know what's good for them, and what therefore the possible counter to that argument would have been, look, people may not look what's good for them, and empirically that doesn't seem to be so well founded. Now, let's come to the core point that I really want to spend most of the remaining time with. Why universal and why not targeted? Okay, and really think through I already gave you an outline as to why possibly universal, because you cannot verify income, etc. But let me take on this argument in a more thorough way and compare that with more targeted programs. So on the positive side, what it does, being a flat amount that's not targeted to the group, any group, it prevents inclusion and exclusion errors associated with any means tested or contingent assistance programs, such as including cash transfers. And essentially, that is really the main advantage of this. Now, on the negative side, though, as we know in economics, and maybe that makes us the dismal science, or us to be somewhat pessimistic about the overall state of the world, that's a positive, but all positives come with something that is not so positive. And this is the real cost of UBI as far as I'm concerned. And if you think through it, you will also realize this is one of the things. Just imagine, suppose I'm going to give out an amount of money X, yeah? If I have to give it to the whole population, and suppose we just use percentages, under UBI the budget will be 100x. Under any targeted program, the budget would be 30x, and therefore right away you have a problem. Now, of course, we know what the counter argument is, that 30x may well be going to people who really don't deserve it, etc., etc. But there's no dodging this bullet, that the fact that any universal program is going to be essentially expensive, and therefore we are kind of caught between the Scylla of targeting and the Charybdis of essentially universal programs being expensive, if I use the Odysseus example of which way we want to go. Okay, so this is a real one. So therefore, I want to now spend the next 5 to 7 minutes talking a little bit about the feasibility side of things, because clearly you could say, okay, we are convinced that UBI has some of the positive features that I outlined, and if I were to take an optimistic view, suppose I persuaded you that these are somewhat compelling cases. What about the cost of it? Is it something that we can afford it? Okay, and in my view, that genuinely is the most important question. So, of course, I'm not saying I was only I was speaking kind of lightly when I said that we are all persuaded about its merits, ignoring the budget issue. Okay, so let's, as I already said, that if you really have to think about, actually, I'm going to skip this one. Sorry. So some of the additional arguments I was going to make and go straight to the case of India. So clearly, we need to think about ways of funding it. And the ways of funding this would be, as we know from standard budget arithmetic, would either have to be some existing programs that would have to go, okay, or some additional taxes that would have to levied, or certain reforms carried out, institutional administrative reforms, which would give us the confidence that the effectiveness of the spending or the effectiveness of the tax collection would go up. Without this, how are you going to raise a certain amount of money? So let me go actually straight, skip a little bit of some of the additional arguments and go straight to the case of India. And I did also have some theoretical things that I was in my more expansive planning stage thinking of covering all. But I want to come now to one of the maybe the core parts of the feasibility argument. So having covered a bit of the desirability argument. So, okay, this is the crux. So suppose we decide, let's try to figure out some ballpark numbers, okay? So I did the following calculation, that suppose we want to take the poverty line measure, okay? So, and that is something, as we know, that in India, unfortunately in the last 7-8 years, we don't have an updated dation of the poverty line. The last one we have is by Rangarajan, that goes back to 2011-12, and it is, we are waiting for an updating of that. But suppose we take the Rangarajan line, okay, whatever he decides as to be the minimum income per person per day, that basically below which you're poor, yeah, and adjust for inflation, because otherwise it would not be a very sensible calculation to take a 2011-12 number and then use, say, an income which is 2018-19 or 2017-18, whichever income you plan to choose with it. Okay, so I have updated the Rangarajan numbers, converted them into per year sums, okay, from person to per year, person per day to person per year. It's going to be 9% of the GDP if you just wanted everybody to have the full Rangarajan amount. Now, of course, the reason I mentioned this amount, because we could right away see that this is a large sum, okay? And just to give you, and again, I'm trying to be completely sort of, be fair and clear about this point, because it's no point sort of dodging the basic arithmetic of what a universal program costs. So if you really convert this 9% of GDP to the corresponding fraction of government revenue right now, because this is fraction of GDP, but if you just think about government spending, that would be about 50% of government spending. Okay, so therefore this is clearly impractical. This is no serious suggestion, whether it's for UBI or any other proposal. Give me any category. It is hard to think of something that would use up 10% of GDP or use up more than 50% of the government revenue and do that. So what do we do this? Okay, and I also did the number for the US, but let me skip that bit. So in particular, now let's think through some of the difficulties of it. So my first answer to that number would be, as I will show, in fact, in greater detail in just a second. Actually, let me skip this. So let's go to this. So if I did this number, which where I have given some more details compared to the last slide, one obvious way would be to curtail it. Rather than giving the full poverty line amount to everybody, we can essentially go and give even ranging from 10% of that to 100% of that or whatever. We can always give 1 rupee to people. That would only be nominal and not be useful, but at least as kind of planning exercises go, we can basically do sort of the 100% of that full poverty amount. That would be 9%, which is impractical, but we could scale it down to any proportion that we think is possible. Okay. Now, essentially, what if you want to compare with some other comparable government programs, one is MG-NREGA, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which basically gives people money if you are willing to a certain minimum amount, number of days per year, if you're out of a job or you don't have anything that's very lucrative in the private market. Okay, you're given some kind of public works program. So that essentially is only 0.32% of GDP and about 2.23% of total expenditure. So this is just to give you a sense of what sort of a welfare program, a comparable one, what the relevant percentages are. If we look at all the direct subsidies, and this is really important, so these numbers, these are actually, once you start looking at them, they actually are very, very interesting and insightful. If you take food, fertilizer, everything together, all the explicit subsidies in the central government budget only, and that's important, that's still about 1.7% of GDP and 12% of total government expenditure. Okay, so these are relatively, nothing in comparison with a full poverty line universal basic income. But if you scale it down, for example, if you go to something like 1,000 per person per month, which is far less than what is being talked about under the current minimum income guarantee thing, but give it universally, which is not the case with the current minimum income guarantee thing, it gives you about 6.5% of GDP. Still a high number. I'm not, if I put on my fiscal realist hat, I can see that these are hard numbers and it's not obvious how are you going to fund it. Okay? But here I would say, once we are actually convinced, and that is far from a given, I would say in all humility, that if this is a desirable path to take, you still can essentially think of scaling it down to a level that is affordable, so long as you can release some funds from expenditures in categories that are less easy to justify or increasing certain taxes. Okay? So let's think about some of these. So one thing would be some of the subsidies ought to go. I think that's very clear, that you can, I think there's very little case to be made for certain fuel, fertilizer type subsidies when you can convert them into a direct benefit transfer of cash. Okay, with food there's a debate going on, and that's where something that I really don't want to, given the big picture nature of this, I'm happy to come back to it. But even if you just cut the fertilizer and the fuel subsidy, it will go to some degree. So you could release something like a 1.2% of GDP that you could potentially use for UBI. And I've already given you the math from which you can work out the per person per month or per person per year sum. Okay, it will all be proportional. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So there's a really interesting report that was written by Sudipto Mandal of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, who's an expert on public economics, with his colleague Sunanda Sigdar in 2018, where rather than looking at central government explicit subsidies, he looks at central and state government explicit and implicit subsidies and adds them all up. What is an implicit subsidy? Implicit subsidy is when something of a government service is underpriced. Think of, say, railway tickets. If you can make the argument that is underpriced compared to some reasonable alternative, that's an implicit subsidy. Whereas an explicit subsidy is that there is a market price and you're filling in, or you're essentially, filling in some part of that for the consumer and de facto the producer. So if you really add them up, here it gets better, because those essentially about 10.6% of GDP. That's a big jump from that 1.7 number, and that's why this document is very important. Okay, so it's by Mandal and Sigdar. Okay, and what's interesting, they also work out the merit and non-merit components of this expenditure based on some arguments that certain goods and services are primarily targeted to the poor or benefit the poor. That's why I shied away from advocating that we should curb, or get rid of food subsidies, because you could all argue that basic food is something that the poor, as opposed to more affluent, would go for. That's about 5% of GDP. Half of this is going to that. Now comes something, this really again is a striking number. If you think about the number of tax concessions or incentives on income tax to corporates, individuals, or associations of individuals, until 2014-15 in the budget, this category was showed explicitly, and now you have to kind of back it out some other ways. But that's always been the case, that there is this sort of essentially de facto tax concessions when you negotiate and you essentially allow people to pay less taxes than otherwise. Then actually what is called as revenue foregone, that's 6.5% of GDP. Yeah? So my point here is not that there is a magic bullet that tomorrow would allow us to completely get rid of this category. Okay, I'm not saying that that would not be impractical. Similarly, there is no magic bullet that there would immediately allow us to get rid of all the explicit and implicit subsidies. But to argue that there is no fiscal space to have even a minimum income where we can all agree that, look, let's make it 1% of GDP, if we were to be convinced. Okay, suppose we are convinced that this is the best way to do direct transfers than through in-kind or conditional transfers. Now, of course, the other way would be, and I don't want to, given the shortage of time, want to spend too much time on this, but I'm sure many of you would have ideas here and reactions, positive or negative, to it. But you could well argue that certain forms of consumer expenditure, certain luxury goods, or certain inheritance, etc., there are other things you could think of raising tax revenues more in line with, say, other developed countries. I'm not suggesting anything that is very draconian, but anything that brings our taxes of these categories more in line would essentially raise more revenue. Okay, so this is my rough summary of how you would want to approach the funding issue. But as I said right away, the funding issue is where a lot of us who initially would be very enthusiastic about it, our enthusiasm starts sort of like a balloon that deflates a bit. The fiscal realities, of course, constrain us in terms of what is affordable. Okay, but here let me make the following case, and then I'll try to wrap up and not leave some time for questions and answers. So let's think about this way. What is the difference between having, say, a 6% growth rate or a 7% growth rate of national income? Okay? Or what is the difference between having a 7% growth rate and 8% growth rate of national income? Now, if you think about it, that means compared to earlier trajectory of income, there is basically a 1 percentage point or 2 percentage point increase in the growth rate itself. But that means that percentage of national income has essentially become available as an extra amount compared to what was available before. So clearly, one could tie what percentage of national income we devote to UBI based on some kind of growth targeting. You can think of frame UBI as some kind of growth dividend, and you could argue that when growth rates go down or growth rates go up, you could somehow make it more contingent on it. So this is again a way of adding a fiscal realism and a kind of practical sort of sense into some of the discussions here. Okay, So given that I'm short of time, and indeed if you in the questions I wanted to speak a bit about the minimum income guarantee, but let me not get into too much of it. So essentially the main difference, and why I think we should keep the discussions separate, essentially the main problem, what is the minimum income guarantee that is being discussed by one of our key opposition parties in India in the upcoming elections. Essentially, it's a targeted program to the poor. It's not a universal program, but it's a cash transfer. And sums like 6,000 rupees per person is being talked about per month that will be given to the 20% poorest families. Okay, so that's basically the program. Now, other than not being universal, that to some may not be such a sin, because that is just a categorization. There are two basic problems with the formulation of this scheme, okay, and which is why it is something that we should really think much more carefully about than what some of the more uncritical sort of views have led it. So if you think about it, initial version of this program basically said, if your income, the target income is 12,000 rupees per person in the poorest sections, right? If you have 12,000 rupees per month, that is considered to be the minimum satisfactory income. So if you now have 4, you'll be given 8. If you now have 7, you'll be given 5. If you have 6, you'll be given 6. Immediately, people pointed out that, look, this assumes A, income verifiability of a very high order, and B, suppose my real income is 9. If I honestly report it, I get 3. If I shade it by 1, I get an extra 1,000 from the government, right? So clearly, therefore, like income taxes, people would have to have a tendency to hide their income so that they don't pay too much taxes. If how much you get depends on your income, that will be a problem. So in the current iteration of this policy, and that's where again it's very different from UBI, it's been now said, and again it's not in any explicit policy document, but this is what some of the spokespeople who are discussing it are saying. No, we understand this filling in the gap is a bit of an issue, okay? So what we're going to do is we are talking about flat sum of 6,000 to be given to every family in the poorest 20%, based on our estimate that most of the poor earn at least 6,000 rupees per month, and then we're going to give this extra 6,000. What's the problem with this argument? Think of a person whose income is 11,990. You're just about below 12,000 and you're going to get a flat amount of 6,000. And suppose your income becomes 12,000 and exactly 100, right? Immediately you're not going to get any benefit, okay? So this, I'm not saying to pick a particular policy or take any side of this particular debate, but really related to the universal basic income, that's why great minds such as Milton Friedman and James Tobin came to this argument, because these problems were not invented with this particular announcement. This is the problem of any targeted scheme, of which minimum income guarantee is one recent example. But this is the core reason why you will have you have a problem. Okay, that implementation of this would be problematic, and my humble submission would be a flat income transfer would be better. But again, just to make it even-handed, the current government's PM Kisan Yojana is very similar, except for you need to have 2 hectares of land to qualify for that, and the sums are lower. So because sums are lower, it's more fiscally affordable, so that's a good thing. But because you also put in a conditionality of 2 hectares of ownership of land, you could well argue that from the targeting point of view, right, it is not going to reach the the landless, the agricultural laborers, etc. Okay, so this once again would the key problem of targeted schemes. So I want to conclude my discussion here. I'm trying to keep things within sort of time, and I had lots of things to say. So let me just, one of the things I'm almost too tempted, I'm suffering a behavioral bias at this moment, because this has been something I'm working on more academically and not really relating to some of the Indian debates. One way to combine some of the advantages of targeted schemes with the advantages of UBI would be have a hybrid where you get a flat amount, okay, like the things we are discussing, and we could discuss the sums as to what would be fiscally affordable. But then you have a combination of this and an employment guarantee scheme like the one we already have, because what is the great advantage of that NREGA? And that too has its problems, but from the targeting point of view, what is the great advantage of NREGA? There is no free money. You actually have to show up and work to get the money. So therefore, de facto, you have income verification, because essentially how much you're working and what you're getting, right? That is something that depends on your own actions, and it is assuming people just don't like to work, or those who are more affluent, they would not necessarily want this costly way to get welfare. That would be one combination of having a small base amount which is uniform, because that takes care of really vulnerable people who are not even perhaps in a position to work for this. Okay, so that would be, and again, like all other policies, I'm not saying this policy doesn't have a problem, and I'm happy to come back to that. So I just want to make 3 philosophical points. And in a way, I foreshadowed them. I'll make them quickly, and I'll then really welcome an opportunity to have a few question and answers. First is, look, all policies have pros and cons. Please don't knock down UBI because it has cons. All policies have them, and therefore we really should be talking about relative pros and cons of different policies, and some may work in certain cases and not in others. Okay, so therefore, just having a weakness of a policy is not sufficient. Second is, one size does not fit all. So one of the problems is, in terms of the big debate about various welfare policies, is the earlier statist model, which in a way derived also from some kind of a central planning idea, has a prototype of what constitutes development, and really trying to sort of make sure that every village, every area in some ways is conforming to that model. I think whenever we discuss policy, we should be open to the fact that what works in Goa may not work in Bihar, or what's good, what may work in Bihar, and then that would be maybe a harder task to figure out. And that may not work so well in Goa. So that's my second point. And the third point is that, and this is extremely important, maybe not so much from the point of view of general citizens or thinking folks, but at least in the policy domain, what unfortunately happens is often people not only come up with ideas, but then they have to sell it. And in the process of salesmanship of an idea, you kind of try to project it as a magic pill. This is what happened with microfinance. In the 70s, when Yunus started it, it was really not that well known. By 80s and 90s, it was celebrated all across the world as the almost sure shot way of bringing the poor out of poverty. And then after his Nobel Prize, luckily for him, he did get that before that. After that, in the last 15 years, we have one study after the other that's showing that, look, microfinance has some limited gains, but overall, it really has not worked that well. And I always have the problem, it's like coming up with any pill that if you have this pill, all your illnesses will go away. And that's always a false promise that in some ways we should guard against. Anyway, I'll stop here, and I will let the chair conduct the Q&A. Thank you.